What would you do if I handed you $1,800 and told you to build a successful coffee business from scratch? Most people would probably laugh. After all, $1,800 barely covers a commercial espresso machine, let alone rent, inventory, permits, and everything else that comes with opening a coffee business in America. But for Ethan Carter, that small amount of money became the starting point of a journey that would completely change his life. Today, Ethan owns a thriving coffee business that serves hundreds of customers every week, generates consistent revenue, and has built a loyal community around a simple product that millions of Americans buy every single day. What's even more surprising is that Ethan didn't come from a wealthy family, didn't have investors backing him, and didn't spend years studying business. In fact, when he started, many people believed he was entering one of the most competitive industries possible. Coffee shops were already everywhere. National chains dominated entire neighborhoods. Independent cafes opened and closed every year. From the outside, it looked like the odds were stacked against him. Yet somehow, Ethan found a way to turn a tiny budget into a real business. And the most interesting part isn't how much money he eventually made. It's the decision that changed everything before he sold his first cup of coffee. Because while everyone else focused on what they couldn't afford, Ethan focused on something completely different. That single insight allowed him to start with almost no capital, attract customers faster than expected, and build momentum long before he looked like a serious business owner. But before we get to the strategy that made it possible, we need to understand why Ethan chose coffee in the first place. Because on paper, this was exactly the kind of business most people would have told him to avoid. At the time, Ethan was not looking for a passion project. He was looking for a way out. In his mid-20s, he was working long hours at a job that paid the bills but offered very little freedom. Every month followed the same pattern. He would earn a paycheck, cover his expenses, and watch most of the money disappear before the next month even began. There was nothing wrong with the job itself, but Ethan could not ignore a growing feeling that he was building someone else's future instead of his own. Like many aspiring entrepreneurs, he spent evenings researching different business opportunities. He looked at e-commerce stores, home services, vending machines, and even real estate. The problem was that nearly every opportunity seemed to require more money than he had. Some businesses needed expensive equipment. Others required inventory, warehouses, or large marketing budgets. Every path seemed to begin with a barrier that he could not afford to cross. Then he started paying attention to something he had overlooked his entire life. Coffee. Not as a customer, but as a business. Everywhere he went, people were buying it. Morning commuters bought it. College students bought it. Office workers bought it. Families bought it on weekends. Unlike many products that depended on trends, coffee seemed to be woven into daily routines. Customers returned again and again. The demand was predictable. The habit was already established. But there was one major problem. The traditional coffee shop model was expensive. Rent alone could destroy a small budget. Add furniture, renovations, equipment, payroll, and inventory, and the startup cost quickly climbed into tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars. For someone with limited savings, the idea looked impossible. Most people would have stopped there. Ethan almost did. But during weeks of research, he noticed something that changed his thinking completely. The successful businesses were not necessarily the ones spending the most money. They were the ones solving a specific customer need in a simple way. That realization led him to ask a different question. Instead of asking how to open a coffee shop, he began asking how to sell coffee without opening one. And that small shift in thinking would eventually become the foundation of everything that followed. Once Ethan stopped thinking like a future coffee shop owner and started thinking like a problem solver, opportunities began appearing everywhere. He spent weeks studying local businesses, observing customer behavior, and paying attention to how people bought coffee throughout the day. What he discovered was surprisingly simple. Most customers were not looking for luxury. They were looking for convenience, consistency, and speed. They wanted good coffee without waiting in long lines or driving across town. That observation led Ethan to a realization that would become his hidden advantage. Instead of competing directly with established coffee shops, he could bring coffee closer to where customers already were. Rather than spending tens of thousands of dollars building a traditional cafe, he began exploring smaller formats that required far less capital. Mobile coffee carts, temporary event setups, local markets, and high-traffic community gatherings suddenly looked much more attractive than a permanent storefront. The more he researched, the more he noticed that many successful businesses had started small before scaling. They did not begin with perfect locations, expensive furniture, or large teams. They began by proving demand. Ethan became obsessed with one question. Could he create a simple system that generated sales before taking on major expenses? The answer started taking shape when he attended several weekend community events. Hundreds of people were walking around, shopping, meeting friends, and spending money. Food vendors were busy. Beverage stands were busy. Yet very few offered specialty coffee. He saw long lines forming around the few vendors that did. For the first time, the opportunity felt real. He did not need to convince people to buy coffee. People already wanted it. He simply needed to be present where demand already existed. That insight completely changed his approach. Instead of focusing on opening day for a future cafe, he focused on finding his first paying customers as quickly as possible. Every decision from that point forward was filtered through a single question. Would this help him generate revenue faster? Expensive decor failed that test. Large leases failed that test. Fancy renovations failed that test. But a lean operation with low overhead and direct access to customers passed every time. Ethan had finally found something more valuable than money. He had found a business model that matched the reality of his budget. Now he faced the next challenge. Turning a promising idea into a real operation with only $1,800 available to make it happen. With a clear direction finally in place, Ethan sat down and mapped out exactly how he would use every dollar available to him. There was no room for waste. Every purchase had to help him serve customers or generate revenue. If it did not directly contribute to one of those goals, it was removed from the plan. Out of the $1,800 he had saved, roughly $700 went toward essential coffee equipment. Instead of buying expensive commercial machines, he searched local listings, restaurant liquidation sales, and second-hand marketplaces. He quickly learned that many small business owners were selling quality equipment at a fraction of retail prices. Another $300 went toward inventory. Coffee beans, cups, lids, milk, syrups, napkins, and basic supplies. He intentionally kept the menu small. While larger coffee shops offered dozens of options, Ethan focused on a handful of drinks that were easy to prepare, consistently profitable, and popular with customers. Simplicity reduced costs and reduced mistakes. About $200 was allocated to permits, event fees, and basic legal requirements needed to operate at local markets and community gatherings. Another portion went toward a simple folding setup, signage, and branding materials. Nothing flashy. No expensive logos. No professional agency. Just enough to appear trustworthy and professional. What surprised Ethan most was how little money remained after covering the essentials. There was no safety cushion. No backup fund waiting in reserve. Every dollar now had a job. Looking back, that limitation turned out to be one of his biggest advantages. Because he could not afford expensive solutions, he was forced to focus on what mattered most. Customers. Instead of spending months preparing for a perfect launch, he focused on getting in front of real people as quickly as possible. Within weeks, he secured a spot at a local weekend event. It was not a major festival. It was not a massive crowd. But it gave him something more important. A chance to test whether strangers would actually pay for what he was offering. The night before his first event, Ethan barely slept. He checked his supplies repeatedly. Counted cups. Measured inventory. Reviewed pricing. Not because the operation was large, but because every dollar invested now depended on what happened next. The entire idea would soon face its first real test. And for the first time, customers would decide whether the business had a future. The next morning, Ethan arrived hours before the event officially opened. The setup was simple. A small booth, basic equipment, a carefully planned menu, and enough inventory to get through the day if everything went according to plan. What he did not have was certainty. Up until that point, every decision had existed on paper. The research looked promising. The numbers made sense. The opportunity seemed real. But none of that guaranteed that customers would actually stop and buy. For the first hour, traffic moved slowly. People walked by. Some glanced at the menu. Others continued on without stopping. Every entrepreneur experiences a moment when reality replaces theory, and Ethan was living through it. Then something interesting happened. One customer bought a coffee. A few minutes later, another customer arrived. Then another. The pace was not explosive, but it was enough to reveal something important. People liked the product. More importantly, they liked the experience. Ethan focused on speed, consistency, and friendly service. He remembered names when possible. He asked customers how they enjoyed their drinks. He paid attention to feedback. By the end of the event, he had sold far more than he expected. The revenue itself was encouraging, but that was not the biggest victory. The real breakthrough came from what happened next. Several customers returned later the same day for a second purchase. Others asked where they could find him at future events. A few even followed his social media pages before leaving. Suddenly, Ethan realized he was not just selling coffee. He was building relationships. Over the next several weeks, he continued attending local events and community gatherings. Every event became a learning opportunity. He tracked which drinks sold best. He identified peak hours. He studied customer preferences. Some products that seemed promising barely sold at all. Others consistently generated strong demand. Rather than guessing, he let customer behavior guide his decisions. By the time he reached his first 100 customers, patterns were becoming clear. The best-selling drinks were often the simplest. Friendly interactions created repeat buyers. Fast service mattered more than elaborate presentation. Most importantly, he discovered that acquiring customers was only half the battle. The real value came when people returned. That realization shifted his entire focus. Because if he could consistently turn first-time buyers into repeat customers, the business could become far more predictable. And that raised an even bigger question. If customers kept coming back, how much profit could each cup of coffee actually generate over time? Once Ethan proved that customers were willing to buy, he became obsessed with understanding the numbers behind every sale. Many first-time entrepreneurs focus on revenue because it feels exciting. Ethan focused on profit because he knew revenue alone would not build a sustainable business. Every cup had to make financial sense. He started by breaking down the cost of his most popular drinks. A standard coffee sold for around $4. After accounting for coffee beans, milk, cups, lids, napkins, and other supplies, the direct cost was often between $1 and $1.20 per drink. That meant each sale generated a healthy gross profit before overhead expenses. The numbers became even more interesting when he looked at customer behavior. Many customers did not purchase only one item. Some added pastries. Others upgraded their drinks or purchased larger sizes. The average transaction value gradually increased as Ethan refined the menu and learned which combinations customers preferred. At first, his weekly revenue was modest. Some events generated only a few $100s. Others performed significantly better. But because his overhead remained low, even small wins created meaningful progress. Unlike a traditional coffee shop paying thousands of dollars every month in rent, Ethan could focus almost entirely on serving customers and improving operations. Within months, he began tracking every key metric. Revenue per event. Average transaction value. Best-selling products. Repeat customer rate. Inventory usage. The more data he collected, the more predictable the business became. Patterns that once seemed random started revealing opportunities. Certain events consistently outperformed others. Some menu items produced strong sales but weak margins. Others generated less volume but significantly higher profits. As a result, Ethan made a decision that many entrepreneurs struggle to make. He removed products that customers liked but that did not contribute enough to the bottom line. Simplicity once again became an advantage. The streamlined menu improved speed, reduced waste, and increased profitability. By the end of his first year, what started as a small operation had evolved into a business with real financial momentum. More importantly, Ethan finally understood why so many businesses fail. It is not because they cannot attract customers. It is because they do not understand the economics behind each sale. Now that he knew exactly how the business made money, his attention shifted toward a completely different challenge. How could he create a system that brought new customers in consistently without depending on luck or random event traffic? As the business became more profitable, Ethan faced a challenge that every entrepreneur eventually encounters. Growth was no longer limited by product quality or pricing. It was limited by customer acquisition. The question was simple. How do you consistently bring new customers into the business without constantly spending more money on advertising? At first, Ethan experimented with several approaches. He tested paid social media ads, promotional discounts, and local sponsorship opportunities. Some campaigns generated attention. Others produced almost no measurable results. What surprised him was that the most effective growth strategy turned out to be the least expensive. It came directly from the customers themselves. Ethan noticed that many first-time buyers arrived because someone had recommended the business to them. Friends told friends. Families shared their experiences. Local community groups mentioned the coffee stand online. Instead of treating these referrals as random events, Ethan decided to build a system around them. Every customer interaction became an opportunity to create a positive experience worth talking about. He focused on small details that competitors often ignored. Orders were prepared quickly. Quality remained consistent. Customers were greeted by name whenever possible. Problems were addressed immediately. None of these actions seemed revolutionary on their own, but together they created something powerful. People remembered the experience. At the same time, Ethan became much more intentional with social media. Rather than posting generic promotions, he shared the story behind the business. Photos from events. New menu items. Customer favorites. Behind-the-scenes moments. The goal was not to sell coffee through social media. The goal was to stay visible between purchases. That visibility paid off. Customers who discovered the business at one event would often seek it out at the next. Others shared posts with friends who eventually became customers themselves. Over time, Ethan realized that customer acquisition was not a single event. It was a cycle. A customer discovered the business. They enjoyed the experience. They returned. They told someone else. That person became a customer and repeated the process. Every satisfied customer effectively became part of the marketing system. The results began to compound. Events became busier. Revenue became more predictable. Demand started appearing faster than Ethan could personally handle. For the first time, the biggest obstacle was no longer finding customers. It was managing growth without sacrificing the quality that attracted customers in the first place. And solving that problem would require a completely different approach than anything he had done before. The very thing that made the business successful eventually created a new problem. Customers were arriving consistently, events were becoming more frequent, and demand continued to grow. For months, Ethan had personally handled almost every part of the operation. He prepared drinks, managed inventory, coordinated event schedules, handled customer questions, and monitored finances. That approach worked when the business was small. But as sales increased, it became clear that growth could not depend on one person forever. Ethan realized that if he wanted to build a real company rather than simply own a demanding job, he needed systems. His first step was documenting everything he did. Every drink recipe was written down with exact measurements. Every setup procedure was organized into checklists. Opening routines, closing routines, inventory counts, customer service standards, and event preparation processes were all recorded in simple step-by-step instructions. The goal was not to create complexity. The goal was to create consistency. Once those systems existed, training became dramatically easier. New team members no longer needed to guess how things should be done. They followed proven processes. This reduced mistakes, improved efficiency, and allowed Ethan to maintain quality even when he was not personally involved in every transaction. At the same time, he continued simplifying operations wherever possible. The menu remained focused on high-performing products. Inventory purchasing became more predictable. Supply ordering followed a schedule instead of last-minute decisions. What had once been a collection of daily tasks gradually evolved into a repeatable operating system. The impact was immediate. Team members could handle events independently. Customers received the same experience regardless of who was serving them. Revenue became less dependent on Ethan's physical presence. Most importantly, the business gained the ability to scale. Instead of asking how many hours Ethan could work each week, the question became how many systems the business could support. That shift completely changed the company's future. The operation was no longer built around a person. It was built around processes. Looking back, Ethan would later say that learning to delegate was more difficult than learning to make coffee. But it was also one of the most important decisions he ever made. Because once the business could operate consistently without depending entirely on him, a much bigger opportunity appeared. The model was no longer just working for Ethan. The real question was whether someone else could follow the same principles and achieve similar results starting today. Looking back on the journey, the most surprising lesson was not that Ethan built a successful business. It was how different the reality looked compared to what most people imagine. When people think about starting a company, they often focus on funding, perfect timing, or having a unique idea. Ethan learned that none of those things mattered as much as understanding customers and solving a simple problem consistently. If he could go back and start over, there are certainly things he would change. He would begin collecting customer information earlier. He would track key business metrics from day one. He would spend less time worrying about looking professional and more time focusing on customer feedback. Most importantly, he would stop waiting for certainty before taking action. Because one of the biggest discoveries throughout the entire process was that clarity came from doing, not from planning. Every major breakthrough happened after interacting with real customers, not while sitting at home researching possibilities. At the same time, there are several things he would never change. Starting small forced him to stay disciplined. Limited resources pushed him to focus on profitability instead of appearances. Operating lean allowed the business to survive mistakes that might have been far more expensive in a traditional model. For anyone considering a similar path today, Ethan's advice is straightforward. Do not begin by asking how to build a large business. Start by asking how to create value for one customer. Then repeat the process again and again until a system begins to emerge. Focus on demand before expansion. Focus on profit before growth. Focus on systems before scale. These principles may sound simple, but they became the foundation of everything that followed. The business eventually grew beyond what Ethan originally imagined, but the core formula never changed. Find a need. Create a simple solution. Listen to customers. Improve the process. Repeat. In many ways, the entire story can be summarized by a single idea. Extraordinary results do not always come from extraordinary circumstances. Sometimes they come from ordinary people making disciplined decisions, solving ordinary problems, and building systems that work long after the initial excitement disappears. And that principle is far more valuable than any amount of startup capital.